the gardens of Chailey Ferrers, and Elizabethan Mansion in Hertfordshire. They would be presented as part of the 9-day Great Wensham Festival. Thereafter, the show would move on to a studio theatre in Norwich for 2 weeks. 7 performances in a Billericay leisure centre would be followed by 3 in a public school's own theatre near Crawley, and 3 on the boarded-over swimming pool of a Reading Comprehensive. After a week in a converted Methodist chapel near Cheltenham, the company had a few days' break before the high spot of the tour, 3 performances at the University of Olomouc in the Czech Republic. Back in England, 2 weeks in a former corn exchange in Warwick, a temperance hall in Swindon, and a prefabricated sports dome in Aldershot, would then climax in the relatively sedate booking of 3 weeks back at Gavin Scholl's former base, the Pinero Theatre in Warminster. For Charles Paris, all of this represented, with rehearsals, the rare phenomenon of more than 4 months guaranteed work. It also offered the prospect of recapturing the excitement of constant change, which had largely vanished from the theatre since the demise of Weekly Rep. As well as being cautious in his interpretation of plays, Gavin Scholes was also conservative in his casting. He liked working with people he knew, their familiarity cushioning him against the potential difficulty of actors he didn't know. When he had to introduce new members into this charmed circle, he favoured performers suggested by actors he did know. He particularly liked to use recommended young actors at the beginning of their careers. They were eager and biddable, and unlikely to question the authority of their director. Charles Paris recognized that this approach was uninventive and prevented Gavin's productions from reaching the creative heights, but the system was not one he was going to complain about, since he was one of its beneficiaries. However suitable Charles Paris might be for Sir Toby Belch, he couldn't see the National or the RSC suddenly going out on a limb and casting him in the role. They'd go for someone much more starry and voguish. Come to that, Charles couldn't see himself getting the part in any lesser company where an old pal's act was not in operation. So he was all in favour of Gavin Scholl's safety-first casting policy. It brought another benefit, too. There were other members of the Twelfth Night company with whom Charles had worked before, which is always, or depending on the individuals involved, perhaps usually would be a better adverb, a comfort to any actor. 2 of the cast of Gavin's Macbeth were also in the new production. Russ Lavery had come a long way since playing Fleance and young Seward in Warminster. That had been his first job in the theatre, and his undoubted talent had been then obscured by a callow, puppyish approach to the business. But 4 or 5 years of solid stage and small television parts had preceded the breakthrough when he'd been cast as Mr. Mick Hobson in ITV's Air-Sea Rescue. The show, now into its 3rd series and showing no sign of flagging in the ratings, had turned a young actor of identical talent to at least 100 of his contemporaries into a household name and a household face. Air-Sea Rescue had brought Russ Lavery all of the bonuses of money from escalating fees and foreign repeats, fan mail from half the nation's teenage girls, lucrative offers for personal appearances and voiceovers, and the possibility of saying in interviews that, "I get sent lots of scripts, but I don't like to commit myself to a project unless I feel it is a really exceptional piece of work." It also enabled him to say in interviews that, "I really feel the need to get back to my theatrical roots," which explained his appearance in Gavin Scholl's Twelfth Night. The fact that he was playing the relatively small and ungrateful part of Sebastian did his image no harm at all. Rather, it demonstrated what an unstarry star Russ Lavery was, and how serious was his dedication to his art. The presence of a well-known television name in the cast of Twelfth Night wouldn't do any harm at the box office either. The other familiar face in the company provided Charles Paris with even greater cause for celebration. John B. Murgatroyd was an actor against whom Charles had frequently bumped in his theatrical career, and the experience had always been a delightful one. John B. was a clown, a great giggler, in whose company Charles had been frequently reduced to incapable hysterics and behaviour which would be judged immature in a primary school. John B. was a great person to have around any production. In the Warminster Macbeth, he had given his distinctive and stunningly versatile interpretations of both Lennox and the First Murderer. In Twelfth Night, he was playing Sir Andrew Aguecheek. Since most of Sir Toby Belch's scenes included the wan and winsome knight, Charles was relishing the prospect of building up his double act with John B. on stage as well as off. And it wasn't just the work that was going well. For once, Charles Paris's emotional life was also looking promising. He wasn't experiencing the tense, manic uncertainty of a new love affair, but the solid comfort of an old one. Charles had been married to Frances for 12 years before he finally walked out. He had used all kinds of justifications about the incompatibility of an actor's lifestyle with the institution of marriage, about the need for them both to develop outside the claustrophobia of cohabitation, but the real motive for his departure had been self-punishment. He'd been having affairs away from home, and he felt guilty about them. Walking out on Frances and their daughter Juliet had been a kind of public penance for his misdemeanors. It had also, he'd hoped at the time, been a bid for freedom. On his own, he would be able to follow up on the emotional hints and half-chances that other women offered. What he'd done was hurtful, but necessary to his fulfilling the imperatives of his own personality. Marriage had been part of his growth, but a part that he had outgrown. Of course, it hadn't worked out like that. The freedom for which he had given up Frances proved illusory. Oh yes, he'd followed up on the other women. He'd had some good sex and some bad sex. He made some good friends. He even at times imagined himself in love. But all the relationships left him ultimately empty. There was still a void in his life that only Frances could fill. He'd worried the situation through in his head more times than he cared to count, and almost always came back to the same basic problem. He liked Frances. That was aside from loving her, which he sometimes did, or from time to time feeling towards her an infuriation which qualified as hatred. But the liking remained constant. That was the invisible chain that held him to her. For a total split from a lover, there needs to be a two-way pressure. Not just the overwhelming attraction for the new love object, but also a distaste for the old. Constant comparisons then become inevitable. The new love is not only wonderful, she is also so much more wonderful than the one I am leaving. In fact, when I catalogue the faults, deficiencies, and inadequacies of the old love, the only point remarkable is that I stayed with her so long. Why did I put up with someone so unsuitable for all that time? But such a natural process of fission is rendered inoperable when you still like the old love, when you worry about her, think about her, want to discuss things with her. The loving and the hating are relatively easy to cope with. It's the liking that makes the whole thing impossible. And that, Charles had come to realize ruefully, was the state of play in his relationship with his wife. Whatever else there might be happening in his sex life, and at times there had been quite a bit, he still felt linked to Frances. Whether she felt the same obligation, he was never quite sure. And even in those moments when he did feel quite sure, he was also aware of how much she resented the encumbrance. At times she seemed very distant from him. At times he knew for certain that she had had other men. But did the fact that none of those relationships had gone the distance mean that Frances's relationships were hobbled by the same restrictions that cramped his own? Charles Paris knew that he wanted a closer intimacy with his wife, but he could never be certain how much she shared that ambition. The circumspection of her attitude was not without justification. Charles could not claim to be the most assiduous of men in the protocol of marriage. Even if one were to put on one side the fact of his having walked out on his wife, and he could recognize that that was a significant blot on the marital copybook, his behavior since that time would not always have inspired confidence in a potential partner. He did have a tendency to get distracted. The intention to ring Frances, make contact, fix to meet up was always there, but when he got involved in a production, when he was away for a while, it was remarkable how the weeks and even the months could slip past without his acting on that intention. There had also been one or two regrettable incidents when he had fixed a rendezvous and been prevented by circumstance, or occasionally drink, from fulfilling his part of the arrangement, the small matter of turning up at the agreed place at the agreed time. Charles could fully sympathize with Frances's skepticism when he spoke of a closer future between them. And it wasn't as if she didn't have a full life. Now independent, with her own flat in Highgate, she had risen through the educational system to be headmistress of a girls' school. She was a caring mother and a solicitous grandmother. What possible incentive could she have to make room in her well-ordered life for a man whose moody personality took over any environment like a wet Labrador? And yet, at the moment, she was making room in her life for Charles, and at the moment, the experiment seemed to be working. It was all down to the builders, really. When he left Frances, Charles had moved into a dingy and soulless bedsitter in Hereford Road. Just in the short term, you know, till I find somewhere more suitable. And he was still there. Or at least, he would still have been there, had not the new landlord of the house embarked on the long-overdue transformation of the bed-sitters into studio flats. Once the work was completed, the existing tenants would be given first refusal to continue residence